When starting to learn the piano, especially self-taught, it can be difficult to know what to learn and when to learn it. So in this video, I'm going to give you 15 pieces that are great pieces to learn from the absolute beginning of learning the piano. And I'm going to give you them in 3 levels, which get progressively harder, with 5 pieces in each level. There is also a link to PDFs of all of the pieces that I mentioned for free in the description. So let's get into it. But before we get into the first piece, it's worth mentioning that alongside learning pieces, you're probably going to want to learn both scales and sight reading alongside whichever pieces you are learning. The reason that it's great to learn scales is because 99.9% of pieces that you are going to be learning are going to be using scales. And so they are a great way of not only building up your technique and your dexterity on the piano, but they're also going to help you understand what you're playing and practice the scales that you're going to be using in pieces of music. And sight reading is also good to practice alongside pieces. Many people think that sight reading and reading are the same thing, when in actual fact they're not. Sight reading is your ability to instantly recognize notes that you've never seen before. And if you are an absolute beginner that's never practiced sight reading before, then I would recommend my sight reading book, which has 420 sight reading exercises that start from the absolute beginning. And the idea with sight reading is that you play each exercise only once so that you aren't memorizing the notes. And therefore you're practicing your instant recognition of the notes, rhythms, and patterns. And there is a link to my sight reading book in the description. And if you do choose to use my sight reading book, then I would recommend trying 5 exercises per day. Between scales and sight reading, it's probably going to take you less than 10 minutes each practice session, which means then you can start practicing pieces. And the first piece that you can learn is a piece called Long and Short by Bartok. Now, this piece has no sharps or flats in it, which means you're not going to be using any of the black keys on the piano. And it also only uses one hand position, which means once you know where the first note is, then all of your fingers are just going to sit on the next keys and you're not going to need to move your hand at all. For most of this piece, both hands are going to be following the same notes and rhythm. But one of the biggest features to practice in this piece is the idea of staccato. And staccato is shown in the music with a dot above or below the notes. And this means to play the note really short, detached, and spiky. There are also 4 beats in each of the bars or measures, and most of the music is made up of 8th notes or quavers if you're European, and quarter notes or crotchets if you're European. Because this also might be the first piece that you're learning, it's a really good opportunity to learn how to learn a piece of music. And the idea when you're learning a piece of music is that you want to try and perfect it. And so it's a good idea to break it down into really small sections and repeat sections so that you can concentrate on the coordination, the staccatos, the volume, and then slowly over time you can start accumulating bars. And if you find any sections in the piece of music particularly difficult, then break it down even further and repeat it lots of times slowly before putting it back into context. The second piece is Minuet in F by Mozart. Now this piece is slightly more challenging for a few different reasons, but the first one is that this uses an F major scale rather than a C major scale. Now an F major scale includes the note B flat instead of a B, so every time we see a B, we're going to be playing a B flat instead, which is just 1 key lower than a B. Also, this piece is no longer in one hand position, so you'll have to pay a bit more attention to which fingers you're going to use. There is also 3 beats in a bar this time instead of 4 beats in a bar, and there are some changes in dynamics, which means the volumes are going to be different in different places. So there is mezzo forte, which means moderately loud, mezzo piano, which means moderately quiet, and piano, which means quiet. And you can also see in bar 7 that it introduces something called a triplet, and this is where you have 3 notes in the same amount of time it would normally take you to play 2 of those notes. So in this case, because we have 3 8th notes or quavers, 2 8th notes would normally last half a beat each, so that's 1 beat. And so we have to play these 3 notes in the space of 1 beat. And as well as the B flats that we're going to be playing throughout the music, there are some accidentals in this piece, which means there are sharps and flats written next to some of the notes. And when you see an accidental in a piece of music, it applies for the rest of that bar. For example, in bar 11, we see an F sharp, and there is also another F next to that F sharp after it. So this is also an F sharp because it's in the same bar. So this piece is a little bit more challenging, but once again, take it small sections at a time and think about perfecting the piece of music. The third piece is a piece called Etude in C major by Diabelli. Now this piece is back in the key of C major, which means there are no sharps or flats to worry about unless you see them written next to the notes. However, this piece is a great piece to learn because a lot of the left hand is made up of chords. This gives you an opportunity to start practicing playing multiple notes together in the left hand. And the piece also also actually has a time signature of 2/4, which means there are 2 beats in each bar this time. The next piece is a piece called Minuet by Alexander Reinagel, and once again this piece of music is in 3/4, which means there are 3 beats in a bar, and this is a feature of the minuet itself, and it's kind of similar to a waltz where there are 3 beats to a bar. And this piece has quite a few features that have shown up in previous pieces. So you have staccato, where you've got to play the notes really short and spiky, but you also have a lot of hand independence where your hands are starting to do different things, and your hands aren't in one hand position. So once again, you've got to pay attention to which fingers you're going to use to play the notes. There are also a few crescendos in this piece of music, which means you've got to start trying to get louder while you're playing. And once again, this piece is in C major, so you don't have to worry about any sharps or flats in this piece of music. And the 5th and final piece for level 1 is a piece by Kabalevsky, which is Opus 39, number 13, which is a waltz. And this piece, similar to the minuet in F, also has a key signature that just has 1 flat in it. So instead of Bs, once again, we're going to be playing B flats. And similar to a minuet, a waltz is a piece that has 3 beats in each bar. In the left hand, you have some staccatos to think about, similar to the other pieces, but this time you have to play those staccatos while your right hand is not playing staccato. With waltzes and minuets, it's important to think about having a strong beat 1 and a weak beat 2 and 3, so that you're leaning on the first beat of each bar a bit more strongly. And interestingly, in this piece, we have something called an anacrusis, or an upbeat, which means we have 1 lonely beat at the start of the piece before we go into the first full bar. And when this happens in a piece of music, that beat is often borrowed from the last beat of the piece of music. So the last bar of this piece of music has 2 beats instead of 3. And the way that you would count this is 3, 1, 2, 3. There are also quite a few more accidentals to look out for in this piece, so there are some extra sharps and flats thrown into the piece of music for you to work out. Okay, on to level 2, and the first piece of level 2 is a piece by Le Coupé, and it's called Melody. Now, this piece is also in the key of C major, like many of the pieces we've had so far, and once again, we have a time signature of 2/4, which means there are 2 beats in each bar. However, in this piece of music, it's made up of a lot more 8th notes, or quavers. And so there are quite a few more notes that you're going to have to practice in and try and get control of. And for this particular version of the piece of music, there are no finger markings written in, which means you're going to have to start working out which fingers feel the most appropriate to use and leave you with enough fingers to play the next parts of the music. The next piece to learn is a piece from Tchaikovsky's Album for the Young, and it's number 7, called The Sick Doll. Now, this is the first piece of music where you have multiple sharps or flats to think about, and in this piece you have 2 flats in the key signature, which means every time you see a B, you're going to play a B flat, and every time you see an E, you're going to play an E flat instead. There are also quite a few more accidentals thrown into the piece of music, and in the left hand specifically, we have 2 different voices. And this means that if you were to sing this piece, the lowest note would act as one voice, and then the other 2 notes that are above it would act as another voice. And this is why you have the lowest note, which lasts for 2 beats, and then the next left-hand note comes in after half a beat, playing for 1.5 beats. 1 and 2, 1 and 2, 1 and 2. This is also a piece that has a lot of character, and it's a programmatic piece, which means it's trying to tell a story of a sick doll. And so for this particular piece, you can start thinking about what the notes actually mean and why they have a certain effect. And you also get to make use of that left-hand chord practice that you did in level 1. The next piece is a piece called Sonatina, Opus 36, number 1 by Clementi. Now, this piece is once again back in C major. However, this piece has a lot more things going on. For the most part, in the right hand, you are either playing chord shapes, but with the notes separated out, like the beginning. If you play that together, that would make a chord. Or you're playing scale passages, which will make use of some of the scales that hopefully you've practiced by this point. This piece is also allegro, which means fast, so this piece will be slightly quicker than some of the other pieces we've talked about so far. There is some big dynamic contrasts in there, so you've got to go from playing loud to playing quietly, quite suddenly. And once again, you have the contrast of playing legato notes, so notes that are joined up, with staccato notes, so those short, spiky, detached notes. The next piece is Opus 100, number 1 by Bergmüller, and this is a great piece to do specifically after the sonatina, because once again, you are playing chords in the left hand and a lot of scale passages in the right hand. And once again, you're in the key of C major. And it's also another allegro piece, which means you got to play it relatively fast. But this piece also has a lot more opportunity to add a bit more character into the piece. And you can see this because it's marked dolce at the very start of this piece, which means sweet. And there are a lot more crescendo diminuendos, so getting louder and getting quieter throughout the piece of music. The piece is also in very clear 8-bar phrases, which means you can really practice on telling a story with sentences. So at the end of each set of 8 bars, you can taper off before starting the next set of 8 bars. So this piece will allow you to take some of the technical skills you've learned in the pieces before, but apply it in a much more musical way. The next piece is a piece called Minuets in G by Bach, and this is the first time out of all the pieces that we've seen where we have a sharp in the key signature rather than a flat or no sharps or flats at all. And when we see one sharp in the key signature, then this is an F sharp. So every time we see an F in the piece of music, we're going to play F sharps instead. For this piece, we are back to playing 3 beats in a bar. And the most interesting thing about this particular piece compared to some of the other ones is that we have some ornaments in the piece of music. And ornaments are symbols that are written over the notes as short form for playing various patterns. For example, when you see this particular pattern, this is called a lower mordant, which means instead of playing just a C, you're going to play CBC, which is a C, the note below a C, and then back to the C really quickly. You can also see, like in bar 8, something called an appoggiatura, which is a really small note next to a normal note. And this is a less important note that is going to eat into the duration of the larger note next to it. There is also a lot more hand independence that's required in this piece because the left hand has a lot more to do. So when practicing this particular piece, try and think vertically as to when both hands are coming together, or when you've got the right hand on its own, or when you've got the left hand on its own, rather than trying to learn it vertically with one hand doing one thing and another hand doing another thing at the same time. You will also see with this piece that there are no dynamics written into the piece of music, so there are no louds or quiets, and this is very common in earlier music. And this is because a lot of pieces by Bach and composers around that time were written for harpsichord, which didn't have the ability to play quiet and loud. And this means that you can interpret when you think it should be more loud or more quiet in the piece of music, which means you're going to have to start thinking about why you might want to play it particularly loud or quiet. And that takes us on to level number 3. And the first piece to learn in level number 3 is a piece called Melody by Schumann. Now, once again, we're in the key of C major, and this time the time signature says C, which means common time, and this just stands in place of saying 4/4. So once again, we have 4 beats in a bar. And interestingly, in this piece, there is a lot more going on in the left hand. However, we want to bring out the melody in the right hand, which means you're going to have really good control over what your left hand is doing, so you can keep it relatively quiet while making sure all of the notes are coordinated with the right hand. And so you're going to want to really practice in which fingers you're going to use in the left hand so that you can kind of not think about it too much. And to do that, once again, break it down into very small sections and repeat lots of times, thinking about exactly how you want it to sound based on what's on the page. The second piece in level 3 is a piece called Arabesque by Bergmüller, and this piece is slightly longer than some of the other pieces we've had so far, and once again, we're counting 2 beats in a bar. Here we have a combination of staccato notes in the left hand with legato notes in the right hand, and this is one of the first times that we've seen 16th notes or semiquavers in the right hand. And these notes are a quarter of a beat long each, which means 4 of these will fit in the space of a beat. Once again, we have allegro written as the speed next to scherzando, which means fast and playful. And we also have a lot of dynamic contrasts, so once again, going from loud to quiet fairly suddenly. And when practicing these kind of pieces, it can be easy to skip over those things in favour of learning the notes. So it's really wise to practice in smaller sections, thinking about the dynamics. We also have things like accents, as seen in bar 10, and this is to give the note a little bit more emphasis. And we also have some tempo changes. So we have dim y poco, which means to get quieter and to slow down a little. And then in bar 27, it says a tempo, which means back to the original speed that you were going. So now you've got to start gaining control of the notes and the dynamics, but you've also got to be able to control the speed. The next piece is a piece called Etude Opus 299 No. 1 by Czerny. I did mention an etude earlier in this list, and the word etude just means study, which means they're pieces that are based on a specific technique. And the technique within this piece is scales. So once once again, in the left hand, you have some chords to hold, but in the right hand, you are practicing scale technique. And this piece should end up pretty fast, but the aim of the piece should be to gain control of your fingers rather than to play as fast as you physically can. There are also lots of octave symbols in this piece of music, where there is an 8 and a dotted line on top of the notes, and this means that you should play these an octave higher than what is written. The next piece is a piece called Prelude in E minor by Chopin. So far, there's been a lot of pieces that are based on technique and getting your hands to be in control and do what you want them to do. But now this piece is focused more on how you play the notes. So this piece once again has 1 sharp in the key signature, which means all of your Fs are going to be F sharps instead. And the time signature is a C with a line through it, which actually means cut time. And cut time is the same as writing a time signature of 2-2, which means 2 half notes in a bar, or 2 minims in a bar. So with this piece of music, you're going to want to feel the pulse twice per bar. For the most part, the left hand is mostly playing 8th notes or quavers, but there are quite a lot of accidentals thrown in there and chord shapes that you're going to have to get used to as you start learning it. And the melody doesn't move around too much either, but that should allow you the time to think about exactly how you want to play those notes and why. For example, in the first bar, you have a B with a chord underneath. And then there's a C in the melody, which lifts up slightly before falling back onto a B. So you may want to bring that C out a little bit more to then fall back onto the B. Also, throughout the first couple of lines, your left-hand chords are syncing. So you can really bring out that feeling of syncing as the chords get lower and lower. In bar 16, there is also something called a turn. And a turn is another ornament, which means instead of just playing the note that's written, which is an A sharp at the time, and this means that you play the note above an A sharp, and then the note below an A sharp, and then an A sharp again. Towards the end of this piece, we also have smorzando, which means dying away, and this means both dying away in dynamic, so getting quieter, but also in speed, so getting slower. So a lot of the directions that are written into this piece of music are more about how the music feels and how you should play it, rather than just your technical ability to play it at this point. And the final piece of level 3 is Prelude in C major by Bach. Now, this piece looks very complicated. However, once you know the rhythm for bar 1, you know the rhythm for almost all of the bars in this piece, because it's the same. The interesting thing about this particular piece is, once again, most of these bars are outlining chord shapes. So bar 1 is C, E, G, C, E, which is actually a C major chord. And similar to some of the pieces that I previously mentioned, like the Bergmüller piece or Bach's Minuet in G, this piece has a lot of room for interpretation. So when the chords expand, you can expand with it. So that is 15 pieces that you can learn from being a self-taught absolute beginner at the piano. As I said at the beginning, it's really worth practicing both scales and sight reading alongside the pieces that you're going to be learning over a much longer period of time. And as I said, if you are an absolute beginner and you want to practice sight reading, then my sight reading book is available with a link in the description, and I would recommend practicing 5 sight reading exercises a day alongside any pieces that you're learning at the time. As you start reading more and more music, you may come across symbols that you don't know or haven't seen before, and that is why I made a video that explains 50 music symbols in just 15 minutes. So if you're interested in that, then head on through and I will see you there.